Welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Once again this week, we have a special guest, Dr. Dario Nardi, back with us. Welcome to the show.
Absolutely. Totally stoked to be back for a second chat, as dark as it's going to be.
Yeah, and this week we're talking about the toxic personality type.
Yes.
And I thought we could just start off, when I say the word toxic, you might be listening along and you hear the word toxic, you probably have an image or an idea of what that means. How are we defining the word toxic in this conversation?
So there's a couple of ways we can do it. One way is to just do an internet search and type in toxic personality type, and the person is going to find a lot of fairly consistent definitions. Usually it's going to be a list of traits, things like hostile, selfish, negative, low empathy, power focus, cliquey, judgy, rude, picky, argumentative, stingy, all of these not so nice words. It seems like underneath it all is this element of being manipulative, but I'm not necessarily saying we're talking about folks with psychopathology. It's that sort of middle layer, like they're still functional, but nonetheless hanging around with them is not healthy for us psychologically, just like hanging around Chernobyl is not healthy for us physically. Maybe we're okay for a little while, but then there's a poisonous element to it.
As you were reading that list, I was almost imagining somebody going, well, that describes this person that I know in my life that's this specific type.
Yeah.
And like maybe like an ESTJ in my life, like they're this way. Are they toxic, or is that just ESTJ preferences? And I think there's some maybe like questions there.
Yeah. So there's so my colleague in the type community who has many years of experience, Roger Pierman, came out with this famous book years ago called, or very catchy title, I'm Not Crazy, I'm Just Not You. So what we're talking about here is the percentage of people who actually are crazy. And I'm not talking about clinically crazy in the sense of schizophrenia or something like that. I'm talking more, if anybody here has read M. Scott Peck, for example, is a very famous psychiatrist. The Road Less Traveled is his most famous book. His follow-up book was about like all of his, among his patients, the one who were the most toxic patients. And this is essentially people who, they get lost in some way, and they get ossified in these layers of defenses, and they deploy those defenses proactively, sort of like a reality distortion field, that just like a doctor is supposed to heal this person intentionally or not, usually in a very defensive way, is causing harm to the people around them. And that person could be of any type. Now, understandably, because there are far more of some types than others, I think like 18% of the male population has ESTJ preferences, something like 15%, something like that. We're bound to meet unhealthy versions of certain types over others.
Yeah.
There's also an element that the people who are closer to us in type, especially our own type, we're like, well, that's not great, but I understand. So we like give leeway. So there is an element. There's also generational paradigms, or I would even say like function paradigms. And so for my type, for example, which has extroverted feeling is very low in my shadow area in my stack, the whole paradigm that many folks with FE has, the whole paradigm feels toxic to me. That doesn't mean it is, because there's a subset of people who have that, but I'm particularly sensitive to that. And so I think that that's how sometimes we can feel particular types are toxic, but that's not what we're talking about today.
Yeah, well, and I also think that when we run into somebody who is an unhealthy version of that type, that brings a lot of weight with it. Mm-hmm. It's like the qualitative nature of the interaction is so, it impresses on us so much that we could know like 20 other versions of that type, but they've all been very mundane interactions. Mm-hmm. And so that one interaction with that one person who is really unhealthy gets imprinted in our brain that that's that type, and stay away. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really common too. But I think it's good to create a distinction between specific types that, I mean, I would never, you would never, Joel would never call a specific personality type toxic, because we all know beautiful versions of every single personality type. And I would say we probably know toxic versions of every personality type too, right? They're when you're in this industry and you run into a lot of people and you do a lot of profiling or typing or whatever, you run into a lot of variance amongst each of these types.
And in the Magic Diamond, I talk about or describe for each of the 8 functions that there's an in the dark grip version of each, and then there's a socially adapted and like whole with joy, and so there's 3 levels. And I actually also got that from Roger Pearman, albeit a lot more recently, on huge longitudinal research that he did looking at leaders and organizations, 360 feedback that they were getting from the people around them. There are assessments that look at things like psychological health and maturity, as well as type, because he's a type person. Really seeing clearly statistically that there are 3 gradations, and that there is this version of every type that is sort of frozen in some of the worst qualities of their type preferences. And he often talks about ISTJ, that there's this really unhealthy version that's like stuck in the past, really rigid, often like OCD, critical of others, is going to go down with the ship, but is going to make sure you go down first. And then there's a sort of typical, more like chill ISTJ, who's like just going through life like everybody else. And then he discovered there's also this high performer ISTJ, not necessarily in terms of output, although that can happen, but a person who is open, flexible, has elements of their opposite type well integrated, and is generally a person who has curiosity, who so that's like the perceiving function has an openness to it, and then this withholding of judgment and this valuing of complexity in terms of we're working with a diverse group of people, so that the judging function also not rigid. So we could talk about it that way too, that there's both, the person as a whole or both functions are just really unhealthy in the dark grip, and that's some of that work that's out there too, of being in the grip of a function. But this seems more than that. The toxicity is something that is the person carries with them, and they're sort of trapped in it and wanting to entrap others.
Yeah. So we're talking about somebody who underneath their functions is dealing with a bunch of character traits that are rather unhealthy and are not going to be good. They're not good news for anybody. Mm-hmm. You mentioned crazy. I always think of crazy makers. Mm-hmm. They're the people who come into your life and then just chaos erupts. And then if you're dealing with somebody who has that sort of going on, that situation going on, then they're going to express differently based on type, which is what happens to all of us in every context, mm-hmm. right? We all have these human characteristics, sort of universal human experiences and characteristics, but we experience them and then we manifest them through slightly different ways based on our preferences and our type preferences, but they live underneath all of that, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about the toxic personality type that is a layer underneath how it's going to express with the 16 types.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also a person can be of any age. In my experience, much younger people, they can be stuck or in a bad place or going through a phase temporarily. They're not necessarily branded as bad seeds all of their lives. Very easily, though, I do encounter older people. At some point, something freezes or they go down a particular path, and then there's no coming back from that path for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes it's because the relationships around them are not healthy. And so they become, we talk about development is in a spiral. The spiral can go down as well as up. And I think people can get caught in some kind of negative spiral of bad relationships, bad life circumstances. They feel disconnected. They take on a very defensive stance. They hold really tightly, regardless of their type preferences, or even maybe they've developed their opposite function, but that's not the whole picture. And there's still some shadow stuff that really strongly holds them.
Yeah. Well, I know that as a person who is now in midlife and recently entered it, there is something that gets lost in the potentiality of things. When you're young, you have all this potential in front of you. And so if things go bad, there's a sense of like, well, I have time to fix it, or I have time to go off on a different trail or whatever, or like I'll figure it out. But then you hit this moment where like, actually time isn't infinite, is it? And then I think that there's a couple paths that open up, and one of them is the double down path, which is like, well, no, now I'm going to get grabby and I'm gonna, I'm gonna keep all of my bad behaviors because I was right the whole time, as almost like a retroactive, like a retcon of validation for the whole time, right? And then the other one is, oh, maybe I should get my act together. That's the other path. I think for young people, when they manifest some of these behaviors, sometimes it can be a lack of health. I mean, young and old can be very unhealthy, right? But oftentimes it's immaturity. And so when a lot of these manifest, what you're basically saying is that it's a phase, it's immaturity. They have time to write, so to go down a better path. But when you get older, you should have matured by now. This should be something that has worked itself out. And if it hasn't, I love the word you used was ossify. Yeah. Right, or like calcify, like it's kind of hardened, and so when the combination is, when in a young person you have the extra layer of immaturity, when it's in an older person you have the extra layer of, I don't know if this is going to be fixed.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that ossification can happen simply because not just fewer life opportunities, but there's more that they're holding in terms of baggage. Also, the brain is not as plastic as it was before. And the way I think of it is like people accumulate baggage over the course of their life. And it's very easy to push that baggage down and hold it. And imagine that you have a trash can in your house, in the kitchen, and that trash has only been there a couple of days. It's not going to stink. And you're thinking, well, I don't want to really empty the trash, so I'm just going to use a trash compactor to, like, as my uncle would say, compact 42 pounds of trash into 42 pounds of trash. And then it's there for an extra week or 2 weeks, and it really starts to stink. And to me, that is what I notice now when I say toxic personality, is there something that stinks about the person because they're holding on to a lot of baggage that they really needed to have let go like 20 years ago. And so in a sense, no one is completely lost or irredeemable or like 100% toxic, but are they willing to take the step to let go of all of that baggage, to release it, to say like, maybe I was wrong, for example. Obviously, people have different stories.
Okay, thank you for defining this, giving a little bit more definition to the word toxic, because again, I see it everywhere thrown around right now. Toxic this, toxic that. What are some characteristics? We've talked about definition, but what are some characteristics of a person that is the toxic personality? What does this look like?
So I tend to personally encounter it in two different ways. One way is that people are carrying around this baggage and it's beginning to stink, and they know they need to do something with it. Like even unconsciously, they know they need to do something. So they're going to do something with it. And the options are to drown it. So for example, I mean, with the case of the trash, you're going to spray a lot of perfume over that trash. For a human being, it's like they're going to drink or they're going to smoke or whatever it is in order to make the bad feeling go away as it starts to rise up. Another coping strategy is to simply immerse in work and distract themselves and push it completely out of awareness. And it's more long-term in terms of the self-damage, but that's what happens. It can be expressed as the opposite as something creative. So the person writes, I think the sweet INFP who writes horror stories about serial killers. So that's probably actually a healthy way to process that baggage and get that out. I think something in the reason you mentioned it, sort of why does it seem more common? Well, one is we have this internet where like anybody can be a troll in a sense at any day, and hopefully we'll talk more about trolls. But there's this idea, well, I'm going to take my baggage and I'm going to fashion it into a weapon, and I'm going to use it against other people.
Yeah.
And that also is a way. And then I think something that does make sense at times are people like, well, I got this stuff, but let me try and be a little bit more proactive and think about what needs improvement in my life. And they're going to adopt a behavior strategy. And the example I think is like, think of some dude who just does not have it in the dating department for whatever reason. And so he's going to pick up one of those books as like, How to Pick Up Women. And he's just going to adopt it wholesale. And there's this level then that's basically phony on top of it. And even if it becomes very practiced and then take that into the workplace or in relationships is like a fake confidence and, I'm just going to deliberately act like a bully so that, and then that will work with people his age because it will push them down. But then eventually he'll discover a loop. And if that's a behavior that's sustained, instead of saying maybe that was wrong and I need to mature, then that becomes toxic.
Yes.
So those are different ways I think that people can express it. And then there's some stuff that you and I have talked about, like how it shows up in terms of like the reality distortion field. And I don't know if you want to mention like a few of those things.
Before we go into those characters, I want to take a moment here to highlight a word you used, coping. And this brings up two things for practical application, at least in my life. And I'm sure if you're listening, this might be applicable to you as well. I hear that and I go, when I see a toxic personality, this is a person that's probably coping with life, with trauma.
Yes.
They're hurting. Yes, they're hurting others. They may be hurting me, but this is a human being that probably has a lot of trauma they're dealing with. So that's the first thing is like, because we tend to interpret toxic as something, coming at us, and we don't realize the person on the other end giving that toxicity. There's a reason for that.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the first thing. And then the other thing that I was patterning or coming up with is, this probably really drives us as people often. Sometimes it may be hard to let go of the toxicity we bring to the world. Like you said, this maybe techniques you learn for something you want, they tend to work. And so it's like, well, man, if I work on this, if I fix this part of myself or I work and grow, I might lose my edge. I might lose the thing that drives me or gets what I want in life. So those two ideas came up. We can talk about them later. I just want to anchor them right now in this conversation before we move on to more of these other characteristics.
Yeah. And then that brings to mind, especially the first thing you said, that it's not my role in an interaction to be a therapist for this random person that I encounter.
Sure.
I'm not cut out to be a therapist. If they're really they're bringing the kind of baggage that's enough to be toxic, is not anything I can solve in 5 minutes or even ameliorate. Maybe there's some very advanced, like Milton Erickson, through the magic of hypnotic language, they know how to move the interaction in a different direction. There are some fantastic stories around that. I mean, people who are very, very good at helping those who don't want help. But otherwise, that's not my role to do it. And I would say for anybody then who is listening, it feels like, yes, there is a toxic person in my life who is, say, physically abusive or something like that. Like, it's not your role to stick around and fix them.
Absolutely not.
Right. So there is that piece. And then the other one is, yes, all of us have some elements that are toxic, but we maintain hopefully a certain perspective that's like, even sometimes I forget I do that, but then people let me know and I'm like, yeah, I know I want to do better. And there are cases where people are diagnosed, for example, with borderline personality disorder or narcissism, and they do make a resolution where they're like, oh my God, like you're right. Like this is really tough, but I'm going to work on this. Like there is a percentage of people who push beyond it. So I don't think that people are hopeless either. And that's exactly what you said. At the end of the day, it's for us to have compassion. But they are toxic, and that's very hard.
Boundaries,
absolutely. And when we can, to step away from whatever that is. Yeah. It's like any more than, would you stand next to, an open nuclear pile? The answer is no. Yeah. Are you going to eat the rotten food? No. We already have our own stuff to deal with. And that's my personal take on it. But yeah, those are absolutely, thank you for mentioning that.
So what are these characteristics then we're going to go into now?
Well, I think you and I were talking not just about specific characteristics, but ways that, or reasons that this can manifest in an individual. And right now, I'm in a all the world's a nail because I've got a specific hammer, right? I'm really understanding this idea of what one-sidedness truly does to us. And Jung's concept of the ego and how much we try to protect our ego. And we've just done a ton of podcasts where I'm talking about ego and shadow and persona and individuation like endlessly. So people are just used to me talking about it endlessly. But I think a lot of times when a person gets really toxic, it's because they're still not ready to let go of the shiny patina of their ego. Like they're just like they cannot sort of hold inside of them this idea that they might have all of these other terrible aspects present. And I think in part because we do live in a world, and social media, I believe, has massively exacerbated this, where everybody's persona is basically about as far as we get, except for the people who are really close to us in our life. And so if we're surrounded by nothing but shiny personas, then we get this feeling like we're the only ones who have something wrong with us. You know, like young girls. I feel so bad for young women. We were not designed to see the top 0.00001% of feminine beauty shoved in our face constantly, perpetually, but we are pre-wired to compare. Right. So we're pre-wired to compare ourselves to others, but we're not pre-wired to be in a situation where we're constantly comparing ourselves to the highest echelon of feminine beauty. Globally, right? Handpicked globally, right? And so then there's this like, oh, it must be me. I'm bad somehow. I'm too ugly to be loved. And then you get all this body dysmorphic disorders and all these other, and it turns into this really terrible situation that they didn't ask for. They found themselves in. And it's really hard to go, well, that is a patina, that's gilded, that's a shiny image on the outside that you have absolutely no idea what's going on inside. But because this is the context we found ourselves in, this is the sort of the society we found ourselves in, it's very rare for somebody to present beyond the shiny outer image and expose the underbelly of all the shit that's actually there as a human. And so then we ask people to own their problems and mistakes. We ask them to own all the nasty stuff you're bringing to the world when they don't really have that modeled anywhere. So I'm the one that's supposed to own all this stuff. I'm supposed to say that I'm the person who's been in the wrong this whole time. I already feel like I'm in the wrong all the time. I already am comparing myself to all these other things and finding myself lacking. So I have to own this too. And I think our context, and of course we're also very distracted, right? We have like a 6-second, ability to pay attention to anything, attention span. And the ability to own the toxic elements of who we are requires time, patience, attention, silence and quiet, introspection, and a willingness to be the person who goes, yeah, there's bad parts of me too. Not just bad parts. We all own that we have imperfections. But I mean like parts that are really hard to acknowledge, is like I'm just never going to be good at this thing. This thing right here, it's inaccessible to me, right? And acknowledging those parts of who we are is humbling, right? It gives us a sense of modesty, right? We do have the capacity to be amazing over here, but we'll never be amazing here. This is always going to be a place of uncertainty and struggle. And just owning that means that, well, how do I do that without having this house of cards crumble? Like, how do I maintain a sense of like self-confidence and self-trust if I'm going to be the only person I know that's owning that I have all these toxic traits or some of these toxic traits? So I think the reason why that's relevant is, or in this conversation is, you just mentioned it, Dario, you're not really going to fix anybody, like, unless that's your job.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
unless
yeah,
it's your
yes.
job that you're like a psychotherapist and you see clients, and even it's not your job to fix them, it's your job to like be a Sherpa so that they can go fix themselves.
Yeah.
But you can't fix anybody else. But the one thing that we can do is we can go, okay, well, I wouldn't call myself the toxic personality type, but what are the characteristics inside of me that that are not healthy, or maybe things I can work on? And so when I get around other people who are evidencing this, number one, I'll have developed myself to a place where I can hold strong boundaries. I'll have come to a place where I can like hang there and it's not massively triggering to me. I can sort of feel enough self-respect to remove myself from terrible situations, right? And I can sort of be an energy that offsets some of that toxicity, right? Like, how do I become the best version of myself over time in order to offset all of that? And that's literally the only thing we can do. So I think recognizing the difficulty of the situation we find ourselves in, and then going, but it doesn't matter, we have to do it anyway, right?
So what I'm hearing from you, one of the things is holding ourselves accountable. And I think a lot of times, I've used the word baggage, but those can very many times, and maybe people in the audience can relate to this, they picked up bad behaviors from their parents. Right. And because they grew up with their parents or guardians, whoever, that's normal for them. Or they spend enough time within a particular subgroup or environment, which could even be academia or like politicians going to Congress. Something is toxic, but it becomes so normalized because everyone else is doing it. And an example I can give is this. So I picked up from one of my parents the habit that when I get very frustrated with something and it hasn't worked out, that I blame the nearest person. And I didn't really notice that until I left home for a while and came back, and also from a partner got feedback like, why are you blaming me? And I'm like, yeah, this is just wrong. Like, it's unhealthy. It's like trying to take my frustration, my negative feeling, and just dump it on somebody else. And then it is actually not necessary at all. And so the first step is becoming aware of it. And this is why I think, one form of therapy is going through family baggage and family behavior patterns and looking at those and saying, what are things that my parents do that bother me, and then am I doing them? And they may not actually bother you if you're doing the same things, because that feels like a normal. So then there needs to be some kind of like outside mirror that's held up saying like, yeah, what you doing? Right. And then there's probably a lot of those behaviors, and it isn't even your parents' fault or your grandparents' fault. It's a behavior that's been handed down for a long time. And I think one behavior like that is just something I would occasionally do. But when there's a whole panoply of behaviors like that, blaming, criticism, deflection, projection, that essentially is like the ego has 10 different ways that it's going to take all of its garbage and put that onto other people, then that's what we're talking about when it goes from, I have some behaviors I want to work on, which everybody does, to this person is toxic.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question that's probably going to get me maybe into trouble with some INFJs.
You're always in trouble with the INFJs.
No, I'm not always in trouble with them. I like INFJs. So if you spend any time online at all around any typology community or anybody like INFJs that know type, or actually they know themselves and they say, I'm an INFJ, I am surrounded by narcissists, which I would expect a narcissist personality is a toxic personality. Like we're talking about somebody that's very toxic. And I'm like, man, you are like flies with honey, INFJs. Like literally you have this many, like every single person in your life is a narcissist. And sometimes I'll say this and like, do you know what I'm talking about? Have you seen this online? Like,
yeah. And I think some of it is because a lot of INFJs do have this level of sensitivity.
Sure.
And they're like, wow, everybody else is just paying attention to their stuff.
Yeah.
And not in this like idealized sort of empathizing, loving, connecting mode that they could be in.
Yeah.
And then, the INFJ sits down and has a conversation with them or tries to work on their relationship. It doesn't go anywhere. So it's like, oh, this person is a narcissist. And then it turns out that because 90% of people are not as aiming for that level of connection or even capable of it or authenticity or empathy, they're just like, yeah, everybody's a narcissist.
Which I don't think is an accurate portrayal of all the people in an INFJ's life. I mean, if you have that many narcissists in your life, maybe you're the problem. Like, that's how I would see it. Like, wow, what is it about me that has this many people that are narcissistic in my life? Or is that just a term we throw around? Like, oh, we just casually, like, that person's a narcissist when we don't really mean they're that level of toxicity.
Right. And it can be also that when people have, and I'm thinking just of FJs in general.
Sure.
There's a certain aura that they radiate at times, which says, take advantage of me. And it's not that I see that, but I understand that from type. and have observed it in my life with FJs. I'm like, how y'all taking advantage of so much? Like some person came and they like want to sell you land on the moon and you said yes. I'm like, there's like a reality check that didn't happen there because they so keyed into the person's like excitement and vision and they were chumped in a way. So I think that they do need to be aware of that. And there is like, danger points that it is important for them to withdraw. And then maybe that's difficult. I mean, we're speculating because none of us have INFJ preferences.
Of course. Yeah. I assume almost it's like a way to create boundaries through labels. Like it's a way to try to keep, which I think is a healthy thing, to create boundaries. I mean, we coach FJs all the time. Like boundary setting, approval. You can also give approval, disapproval. You can set boundaries. And so maybe it's a low grade way of setting boundaries through labeling. And maybe there's more healthy ways to do that. And I guess that's the question when we're talking about toxicity. The reason I bring it up is I'm imagining somebody's listening right now, maybe with INFJ preferences, maybe somebody else. It's like, oh yeah, I have all these narcissists and sociopaths in my life because I see it so much online. And I'm like, is that really true? Do the people have that many broken, toxic people in their lives? Like, it's not just one or two. You see this everywhere online.
Well, so it's really funny thing. If we go back and look at psychological types, Jung's work, and he has this chapter 10 where he describes, over many pages, each of the 8 functional types. Most of what he talks about is pathological and not in that severe end line the person needs to be institutionalized. I mean, he uses this blanket term neurosis. And so when we talk about toxicity, I don't mean like, of course, healthy or where the person is like overexpressing or they're compensating, but they're doing the best that they can, honestly. That like they have a meta awareness that's still there. No, they're like one step deeper than that, and they're sort of enmeshed. But when we look at what Jung said and the ways he describes people go wrong, the counterexample, I mean, not with INFJ, but I'm talking type-wise, like ENTJ or ESTJ. So Jung talks about the person who is the pillar of the community and is so effective as a manager and a leader. And from the outside, they look like they have this amazing home life and happy family. And the person, and he's like, usually this is dominant extroverted thinking, is a monster at home. And the family members live in terror of this person. And that is then the kind of experience that we're talking about where it's causing harm, on a long-term basis. And so I think that's great to mention that. And Jung goes in depth about every single type and what they look like when they're getting into that toxic zone.
Yeah, I think with particularly extroverted feeling, just to touch on that for a moment and then to discuss what Jung actually, he had a diagnosis for how to fix that. But for extroverted feeling, I think I've really started to understand the sort of the nucleus component of this idea of an energetic interchange between two human beings that extroverted feeling is super tapped into. And it's like a vibe. And it's not, it's wordless. Like they have to have the introverted thinking part in order to bring words and articulation. But the experience of extroverted feeling itself is not, there's not really words there. It's just the energy exchange between two people. And because that's the nucleus of it, and it's rewarded, right? And because you're in that vibe, you want other people to be in as good a place as they can be because you're getting their energy from them. That's the emotional absorption that all the FJs do. INFJs are particularly sensitive, but they're not the only ones who experience it. All the FJ types experience the energetic interchange. That's what they're looking for. I mean, I've got it as a 10-year-old or tertiary function, and I can feel it too. I love it, right? Give me a hit of that energy. And when you're leading with it, and it's it's the function that you're bringing to all situations, you have to get to a point where you're like, I think I might need to understand where I end and the other person begins. Like if that's your lead, and it can go off the rails, right? But as a lead function, as a dominant function, you have to get to a place where you're not just slurping everybody's stuff. I think as a secondary, as auxiliary, or what we call co-pilot function, you have enough space between yourself and the other person because you're leading with introversion. And so you're going to be fine. You know, you're not going to be putting yourself out there constantly and perpetually. But when you do, there's like this moment where like, oh, I need to figure this out, because if I don't figure this out, right? And as John Beebe calls it, it's a parent function. So you just automatically want to use it in behalf of other people. That's your instinct, right? And so getting to a place where you're using it to self-parent, to do as somebody who has it as a dominant or driver would do, which is understand those boundaries and this is where I end and the other person begins. That's all really critical and crucial, and to be able to have a little bit of psychological distance and space. I think when FJ types classify, like narcissism, and they feel like they're surrounded by narcissists, I think that that's usually an FJ in a moment going, I can't be a sitting duck for this. I can't be a chump. I can't be a dupe. And this is like the first time that they're like, I need to figure this out. And I think a part of that is noticing how many people don't have good intent. Like all of a sudden you're noticing there's a bunch of people out there that I really cannot open my energies to. And so everybody feels like a narcissist for a time because it's like a new awareness. It's a new awareness that I actually can set boundaries. I can disapprove of somebody else. I'm not just on the receiving end of disapproval. I can actually look at somebody and go, well, you're a bad faith actor. I don't have to be open to your energies. And so that's, I think, why there's a lot of labeling that goes on, is because it's that moment in the timeline of them figuring out how to create those boundaries.
Fair enough.
And this actually leads me to where I wanted to go. Actually, I'm going to make a connection here, which is that the labeling, introverted thinking, we call it accuracy. The opposite, or the polarity of that function of extroverted feeling, is all about defining definitions. Labeling is part of it. And I think that's an attempt to integrate that part of who they are to help assist with the boundary setting. And that was Jung's solution. He's like, if you're at a place where you're experiencing any sort of pathologizing, right, any sort of neurosis, the key is to not be one-sided with just that side of the function. You've got to integrate the other side of the function. That's your help. So the extroverted thinking type, who's a nightmare at home, a pillar of the community when they're extroverting, right, when they're part of society, but a nightmare at home, it means that they do not have a relationship, a sufficient conscious relationship with the introverted feeling part of who they are, the polarity opposite. And integrating that part, we now know it's like fourth function, inferior. We call it the 3-year-old. We now know that that's like a critical, crucial component, integrating, giving it space to live, giving it space to present, like understanding that when I said earlier, you're never going to be good at that, but that like looking that in the face, that's that part of us. If we can look at that fourth function, that inferior function, in the face and go, this is always going to be my Achilles heel. We're not going to get, maybe we'll get better at aspects of it if we work super hard, but we have to, like, its purpose is to create humility, is to create modesty. Right. And when we can put ourselves in a position to do that, it means first we have to have an ego that's willing to be humbled.
So this very much reminds me when Jung talked about his therapeutic process. It's like, how do you assist people, or how does it even happen naturally? And he talks about the transcendent function. And he says it starts in the unconscious, that there is the stuff going on. And he's like, if it really is pathological, it's unconscious to the person. But there's neurotic elements that come out that are sort of the symptoms. And then eventually the person will start receiving imagery or having outbreaks from the unconscious. And he says at that point, once that starts to come into awareness, then the question is, because he's like, this is a two-person operation in a way. The unconscious is doing its half, and the ego needs to have sufficient preparation and sufficient gumption, we'll say, to recognize the images for what they are and to engage them. And he's like, that both has to happen, and because, I mean, essentially then the person has a choice about whether to address them or not. So something keeps coming into the background, sort of an awareness, and half the time is like it comes into awareness and then it disappears and the person forgets about it. And it could be another 5 years, even though they've been receiving feedback from other people. They don't really hear it. Thinking of the example of introverted feeling is last. They literally don't hear it. Their unconscious hears this feedback, or their conscience saying like, oh, that's not so good to cheat people, or whatever it is. And then finally, there's like something that may break through. And then the question is do they do everything they can to like clamp down and keep it under control? Or, as Jung said, what usually happens is people take that, whatever has come up, and they project it outside of themselves. And he says it's usually in the social and political sphere that people manage their neuroses through politics. And he means that in the most general sense of the word, like in the cultural and the social domain, but also specifically in politics, by othering other people. And so a classic, I say that there's a couple of ways to know, like, how stressed is your psyche, your unconscious. One way is from the Jungian yoga program, is breath work and simply holding your breath. And if you can't do it for very long, it means your limbic system is overactive and there's something stressing you, whether you're aware of it or not. The other is like how easy is it for people to push your buttons? And, I'm not necessarily talking about the people immediately in your close vicinity, but just in general. Like if you turn on the TV and you become easily enraged watching the news, oh my God, that horrible person, that is a sign of actually unresolved material. It doesn't necessarily mean the person's being hypocritical or something, but it does mean it's pointing to something unresolved. And I think it is so funny to make it practical that the modal type in the type community, at least in the professional type community, is ENFP and INFP. Isabel Myers, INFP preferences. Also, a feminine sort of we've talked about before, like holistic and analytics, is like a holistic version of introverted feeling. Where is a shadow area, that would be this masculine, active, assertive, extroverted sensing and extroverted thinking, both of those. So the moment that person encounters somebody who's like, oh no, I hate that person is just terrible and whatever, they're like, no, I love individual differences, but only the holistic version of extroverted sensing is okay. Not the analytic version of extroverted sensing. And this can come so clearly and say, well, this person is being very aggressive. I'm like, no, it's just a dude, like, and he's doing martial arts and it's not out of aggression. Like, it's an art form, and actually it's the art of being peaceful using your body. And that's a whole other way of looking at it. So I think that even in just purely type terms, that when we think like where we get aroused from outside of ourselves, that's always pointing to stuff that's going in. And if the person is constantly dodging everything that's a potential thing, it's like they get just like, like everything is a hot button for them. It's like, oh yeah, you're expending a lot of defenses and a lot of energy to maintain all the baggage that's inside of you. Yeah. We
just did a 2-part series on getting triggered, right?
Yeah. So that's what it is. Yes.
And that's basically what it is getting triggered is actually, we use the word gift. We know that it doesn't feel like a gift, but it actually brings up some, like you mentioned, material that needs to be looked at. And in that case of the person using introverted feeling, and there's only certain styles of like extroverted sensing or extroverted thinking that are acceptable, it's because they have an unintegrated extroverted thinking inside of themselves. They don't want to see that part of themselves. And when they see it manifest outside, instead of owning that they have that in them and that's why they're getting triggered, instead of doing that, they instead other the person, right? That's not something that has anything to do with me. And that's like that other person.
And that unintegrated, Jung was sort of at pains to say that's not necessarily like something hidden inside your psyche. He meant it also in a practical way, like a person who never gets control or manages their finances. Okay, that is one-sidedness. And that is probably related to a function, sensing or thinking. that they're simply not engaging. The person has decided, no, I don't want to do that version of money is bad, extroverted thinking, so it could be attached to something very specific, and then it leaves in their lives this huge hole, and then they expect other people to take care of it, or they fight for, like a whole political cause that really points back to the fact that they're irresponsible in their own life,
right?
And that they're just unhappy that, boy, you know what, I should have had to do nothing. But I have to do work. I don't like that. So other people should do the work for me.
Right.
And there is that sense of, something we didn't mention. It wasn't on that list at the beginning of qualities of toxicity, but I think entitlement is something that needs to be on that list.
Yeah. Well, and it's a particular issue right now. I mean, I think society has pretty big shadows, pretty big unconscious aspects of itself that it doesn't want to look at. And so we are part of collective toxicity, right? There's collective toxicity happening because we're not looking at components of ourselves that are, that need to be seen. And I think entitlement is an emergent.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. I do have to pause here and ask this, though. So people that have very different viewpoints of the world are going to say the other is entitled, right? We're going to I might have a radically different viewpoint than you, Dario, and both of us might point at the other and say, well, you're entitled. In other words, we're projecting on somebody something that we think is toxic on the other side. And so it's how can both sides be right in that? And yet how can both sides be wrong in that also, I guess would be the question. In that, what's the thought I'm going for here? Basically, it's this notion that we're all throwing these labels at each other, and from our perspective, they make sense. It makes sense that the person over there on this political persuasion or social persuasion is quote unquote entitled in how they think the world should be or how they show up. And so I combat that. But they might have the same perspective about me. They might think I'm entitled too. And so I guess, again, this idea of throwing labels around, I'm not suggesting we don't do it, but it's deeply troubling to me because once we get down to the label level, we all think that label carries a definition we agree with, but it's very subjective in the label we're throwing out based on our own perception of the situation. Does this make sense what I'm saying?
Yes, and so two things come to mind. One is going back to the beginning with that, I'm not crazy, I'm just not you. There is a percentage of people who are crazy. There are social injustices that need to be rectified. There are issues, right? On the other hand, when you said the word paradigm, that really struck for me because it was recently. So I bought something for myself. It wasn't, it was a few $100s, and the person in my family said, "Oh, you really deserve that." It was a person actually with extroverted feeling. I found that really disconcerting and evidence of a whole dysfunctional way of thinking underneath. And the same kind of thinking well, she was saying to me, you are a such and such, in a good way. Oh, you deserved it because you've worked so hard and you're smart and you're a scientist. But my introverted feeling really recoils against that. This idea that I deserve something. I'm okay if I want something or if it's the effective thing to do. But this idea that we live in a world filled with chits and that I did a certain amount of work so I can reward myself with it. And then the whole notion of I am something, I am this, I am that. I'm there's I am and then there's a period that goes there. Or I can say I am doing this now or I did that in the past. But to label myself or self-entitle, because there's this paradigm of sort of, I want to say basically chits. I put in this work or people gave me this title or whatever. My introverted feeling is very offended by all of that. is like, that's trying to add a whole layer. I'm like, that just does not belong there. That leads to a whole way of thinking that is about, it becomes enmeshed.
Yeah.
And whereas I really want to take that position of being like present and compassionate, but also having boundaries. And that's why, you know, for example, like following a Buddhist philosophy doesn't mean you suddenly become like kumbaya nice person, because one is holding boundaries and resisting false, what I would view as a false or misleading, potentially poisonous paradigm. And I see that, you know, regardless of the person's type preferences, they can hold a paradigm that becomes, it could be very functional, but eventually is it like a swamp that sort of consumes the person. And then that can lead to toxicity, because it leads to a whole life path that is like, well, they did this to, like a victim mentality, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's so funny because I totally understand the phrase "you deserve that." Right, my extroverted.
See, I resonate with Dario.
I know. I'm
yeah,
like, I get that.
makes sense to me.
Well, I think it's because, you know, I mean, not that I have a very sophisticated version of it, but extroverted feeling does a lot of, it experiences itself as doing, as giving first. That's how extroverted feeling experiences itself. Like I had this moment yesterday where I was pouring out smoothies. I'd made a smoothie in a blender, and I was pouring out 3 into cups for Joel, myself, and Joel's son, Gunnar. And there was one that had a little less. And I had a moment where I was like, what if I gave that one that had a little less to one of them? And I kept the one that had a little more. And there was a part of me was like, you're not going to do that. And so I gave them the ones with more, and I took the one with less, right? And that's a very extroverted feeling sort of like way of going about the world, right? It's like, I'll go ahead and take the hit. I'll go ahead and take the hit. I'll give the better to others. Not that all FJs or TPs are doing that by any stretch, but that is extroverted feelings experience of itself. So then when it takes for itself, right? When it does something for itself, it's like, you know what? I've given to everybody else first. I'm allowed to have this. I've earned it, right? Like I deserve it. Well, maybe not earned, but it's like I deserve it.
A permission statement.
It's permission. That's right. And so to extroverted feeling, when you say that, it's like you're giving yourself permission to take the smoothie that has a little bit more, right? And you're like, I deserve this. I can do this for myself.
Yeah.
Whereas introverted feelings is like, well, first of all, I wouldn't have paid any attention probably. Wouldn't have even known that one had less. I would just handed out smoothies, most likely.
True that.
Yeah. But if it was like, you know, like if introverted feelings like, you know, I'm not that hungry today, I'll give the other one, you know, I'll take the one with less. Or I am really hungry.
That's exactly where my mind goes.
Right. I am hungry, so I'm going to take one. You know, it's like, what's my state right now?
Right.
I'm going to make my decision based on my state, as opposed to extroverted feelings that's like, dare I take the one with more, right? And somebody's going to get shortchanged.
And I think what you're mentioning is sort of like, if we think of it as along a spectrum in a way, that you're describing extroverted feeling that's a little bit more on the holistic side. It's like giving it and being a hostess and so on. And then that could eventually turn way down the line there on the spectrum to like a victim mentality, the person, the doormat that's always ISFJ, that's sort of the stereotypical is a doormat, stepped on for years, puts up with a lot of stuff.
Right.
At the other end, we go and then there's this analytic extroverted feeling in a positive way that's like the shepherd, and is doing for other people, but also expecting from other people in return, and like assisting people in like forming and maintaining community. Like, what is our responsibilities to each other? I mean, the fact is we live with each other, and we, like, how do you be a good neighbor, for example?
Yeah. Well,
and then there's a toxic version of that, which is like, oh, it's my job to indoctrinate other people in my needs and values.
Right.
In order to force people to get along. And then that ironically becomes a bully rather than a victim.
Yeah.
And so that's when we talk about the toxic, I'm talking about like those ends of the spectrum. And then does the person just do that occasionally, accidentally? Or that's like the one thing? Or is it like, do they become swallowed by it?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, extroverted feeling is tapped into that transactional piece. And I love this idea of like this huge sort of like this huge scale, sliding scale of like for extroverted feeling. And a lot of FJs would not know this is possible within this spectrum. They would never self-assess as a bully. But bullying, social bullying, is at one side. And then the other side is, like you said, is no boundaries, exposed underbelly. Like, it's like just roll over and take it. And that is a huge, huge spread. And like you mentioned, people on the edges have the challenge. But I want to go back to the solution, which is integrating the other side of introverted thinking, because introverted thinking gives both of those sides. It gives it a place to reflect on one's, like, where can I and my behavior and my choices and my optimization, where can I change things here? Like, how can I become the better version of myself? And I know I mentioned introverted thinking is defining before, but a part of the reason why it's doing that defining is because it's ultimately trying to figure out, how do I have the cleanest thinking possible? And if I have the cleanest thinking possible, that means that I'm going to have to accept reality as it is from the start. I don't want to be a part of a fantasy. I don't want to think whatever I want to think and and then get,
not placing
down.
Being right before being actually right.
Exactly. And then I get down this line of thinking, and all of a sudden I realize that this line of thinking is leading to pain or tragedy or problems. And then now I have to go back to the beginning and go, where did I go wrong? Right? Like, introverted things is like, let's just start from a clean place.
Yeah, that's so tough though. I mean, I have talked to folks, specifically I'm thinking of INTP, where he's like twice in his adult life, he's like, I had to restart from zero. In terms of like my philosophy of life. He said that was very, very difficult, rewarding, but very, very difficult to do, to realize like, wow, this whole edifice of these strategies and like the way of evaluating things is very tough. And it's so interesting because I feel like the way you describe it is from an introverted thinking perspective, like within the framework of type. My introverted feeling wants to go to this like existential place,
right?
That the toxic person is suffering from like a kind of existential fear. And what comes up for me is, and I didn't see this movie, but I heard it from a FP type who did. So very briefly, and this is a character piece, there's a couple, they're in their late 30s. They're not really so happy with each other anymore. They both have lovers on the side. They, are amicable as much as they can. They have a son who's like 10 or 12 years old. And they decide they're going to get a divorce. And it's not like a big argument or anything. Like, they're going to get a divorce. And they're like, but who's going to take the son? But I'm like, no, I am so like loving my new life with my new partner. It's like, well, can't you take him? No, how about you take him? So the son overhears this and he runs away. And so it begins this whole story of like, of course, like they feel the thing that they need to do is to call the police and like what happened to him, and the police look for him and so on. And meanwhile, they work with each other, but they also go back to their lovers and discuss, and the police don't find their son. And then they really have to make a choice within themselves. Like, should they keep looking or not? And should they keep caring or not? Should they take responsibility for the fact that it was something that they said that made their son run away, because neither of them wanted this responsibility in their lives? Should they just go and lead a selfish life for themselves, or take some responsibility for this? And that's what the movie proposes, like a deep existential choice in life. And then when we go and say, I'm just going to do what works for me, that person is going to end up with a lot of loneliness later on. In like a very, even superficially, they have friends or fans or whatever it is. And then the other direction carries weight and responsibilities, but it also doesn't have that loneliness that goes with it. And I think that there's an equivalent that developmentally either stretched out over a long period of time where there's hardship, or it's something specific that comes up and the person's like, God, I have to make a choice. And they make a choice, and it's a choice that leads to toxicity.
Yeah.
And that's because they're like, I can deal with this problem and grow, or you know what, I'm going to push the problem away and say that didn't really happen, or just ignore it. And then it eventually will probably come back. And if it doesn't hurt them, then the toxicity will be extroverted onto the people around them.
Right.
Yeah. It's like, who suffers from bad politics? Not the politicians.
Right.
It is all of their constituents.
Right.
Yeah.
That actually makes me think of a conversation we had, Joel, where we were talking about spoiling, and children who are spoiled, their parents are basically front loading their happiness.
Yeah.
right? It's like they want the child's youth to be filled with happiness and anything that they want. And I think it's a selfish choice on the parents' side because they want to be a part of it and they want to be the ones who provided it. But when you choose to spoil your child and never tell them no, well, as soon as they get out to the world, nobody else is going to do that for them. And so now they have to figure out how to navigate a world where they're completely unprepared for how little everybody else cares about them. And oftentimes they show up with toxic behaviors because they're used to demanding to get what they want, and now nobody cares, so they're just going to have to double down on those behaviors. Whereas if parents choose not to spoil their children, choose to prepare them for the world, well, they might be quote unquote front loading the pain, right? The pain of having to figure all this stuff out and be told no and deal with disappointment and anger and a sense of unfairness and injustice and like all that stuff. Discipline. That's right. Discipline, which is hard to build, but so crucial and critical.
Not punishment, discipline specifically.
That's right.
Yeah.
Discipline meaning that like the ability to hold to a routine, the ability to do things when it's tough to do, like like the little
all of the ISTJ things.
Yeah.
No, I mean the positive, healthy
Right.
ISTJ, like hold to a routine, be disciplined, follow through with your word.
That's right.
Act honorably with
That's right.
integrity.
That's right.
Yes.
And so when you front load that, now they enter the world vastly more prepared. And now you haven't front loaded their happiness. You've allowed them to be able to generate their own when they become adults. So you're the bad guy because you're not giving them everything they want. And you kind of have to take that hit. But you certainly didn't place the happiness at the front and leave them with unhappiness until they figure it out, if they ever do. And basically what you're talking about too is in this choice of, are we going to take responsibility and do the hard integration work of, I'm oversimplifying it by calling it integrating the other side of our driver function, our 3-year-old, right? Because that's like a domino, right? Go integrate the 3-year-old or inferior function. That's a domino that'll kick off this whole, modesty, humility, taking responsibility, finding the other side, like not projecting outward all of the problems, etc. Like that's one of the trigger points or the beginning points of this work. But you can do it in other ways. I mean, a lot of people right now are into like attachment theory, and so they're getting to that same place by asking, "How am I insecurely attached?" And then how is that manifesting in all my relationships, and how do I handle it on my own, right? As opposed to projecting it onto everybody else in every relationship I've ever had. So there's lots of tools for it, but it's basically taking responsibility. And the choice is, do I want to front load all my happiness? Do I want to be able to demand everything I want right now, or a needle, or whine, or bully, or, just manipulate,
complain, right? Deflect,
right?
All of those things,
and not
tell stories. That's
right. And not deal with all the stuff that I need to deal with, and then pay all that price later, either myself or other people in my ecosystem. And now it's like it's play now, pay later, or pay now, play later. And so where do I want my happiness to be? And people who do the work of integrating all of these aspects of themselves and owning, and I think what's really important, or at least why I'm actually pretty happy we're having this conversation, even though it's been a little bit all over the place, and that's okay, but I think it's a good conversation, is most of the time when I hear conversations around toxicity, it's always like everybody else is toxic. But there's not much you can do about that. And we can even talk, like what if you're in a relationship with a toxic person, or what if you're around a toxic person? There are things you can do. But I really believe that most conversations around toxicity would vastly improve if we go, okay, and what am I bringing to this? Because even if I only have like a couple toxic behaviors, if I'm around a person who's toxic, they're probably going to bring those behaviors out in me, right? Because I'm going to want to fight fire with fire. And then I'm going to get into a toxic relationship with that person, because now we're both bringing toxicity to the interaction.
Which brings up one of the things. So it was, 5-7 years ago, something like that. I decided, you know what? The stuff I read on Facebook or in a forum or whatever, I don't need to respond. Like, I literally don't need to respond. It was just like an internal change. And most of the time, like occasionally I will call somebody out as like, literally, you're just being a troll. But mostly it's just like block, next. because otherwise the toxicity is that's it. Like something is rotten, and everything it touches is also going to be rotten. And I'm not saying like the person is bad, but it could be that they're carrying a mind virus, which is unhelpful. Or the thing that we may not necessarily notice right away, we're not just talking about people directly, but anytime any kind of message is being received that is designed or is there to incite fear, anger, blame, labeling, that's like, I turn off the news. I might look at some headlines just to have a vague sense of what's going on, but like I recognize it for what it is. It's manufactured. Mm-hmm. It's there and they use anger and fear in order to get people to come back, to arouse people. And I'm like, the healthiest thing I can do for myself psychologically is turn it off. Unless it happens to be something that I can personally do.
Right.
To address it, as you said, like if there is a place for me to take responsibility, otherwise it is literally trying to drag me into a toxic relationship. So I would say that one of the reasons I sort of brought up the toxic personality is because even if the number of individuals in society who are like so toxic is not that many, the culture itself right now, I would say, is extremely toxic.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Question for you. You mentioned something that made me recoil. I felt myself like, whoa. Somebody posts something and you said, block next.
Yeah.
Immediately I recoil because how do you know, this is a very personal question maybe to you, but also the person listening, like how do we know if someone's being toxic or they're triggering something in us that we need to address? Like they're saying something that's getting us to, like it's making us feel bad or feel icky or weird.
Right.
And because sometimes we just go block next when that happens too.
Right.
So
and
how
that
do
was
we know
actually
that?
input we needed.
Yes. So that's what I would fear.
It's when there's, so I don't usually ever do that immediately. I use the ENFP technique of like micro pinging. It's like you give a little bit of a response and see how the person responds back without a big investment. And is there a game going on? And trolling is an example of somebody who's playing a game. So an example would be this. The person who posts something that is aggressive, but not explicitly very rude. It's just aggressive. And then the moment anyone responds back that isn't perfectly nice, that person is accused of being rude. And therefore, there's a game of always like, oh, well, I can be basically over the top like a bully, but if you do it, then I'm going to immediately call that out. And this is a particular kind of game that can be played. Or with introverted thinking, there are ISTPs and INTPs who play the nitpicking game a lot. And it's like, they say, oh no, I want a purely like intellectual conversation about the topic. And I'm like, no, actually, you clearly don't. Because you don't want to, you're very closed and you just want to nitpick certain things. And let's say they say several things which are materially untrue. And then they'll be like, oh, you're right, this is this. But, and then it just turns back to something else. And by the time 3 interactions have happened, the person has already forgotten or didn't notice what you said. And then it again brings it up. Either they're extremely stupid, but I don't think so. Or they're playing a game, which is the nitpicking game. And Yves Deleuze, talks quite a bit about survival games that personalities play. NTs in particular are prone to the nitpicking game. Mm-hmm. And it's a way to express their ego and to feel good. And it's a kind of like intellectual bullying or intellectual masturbation, to use that French word. And is just like, I don't want to be a part of that.
Yeah.
I do lodge it in my brain somewhere, but then I'm like, I don't need to participate. And so when I detect that something is a game, I'm just like, I'm out of here because there's a lack of integrity in the person's interaction.
Okay, then so we could say maybe that your personal metric is genuineness. If
yes.
the person's being genuine in their interaction.
Absolutely,
Even if it's aggressive, maybe a little over the top. Maybe they're not paying attention to detail, but they're really genuinely showing up.
Oh, absolutely. Right. I don't expect that the person, that is going to be perfect or answer all of my questions or like whatever it is. I mean, that's not, it's just about, is the person genuine and are they, especially with something intellectual, is there integrity with it? Or is the person sort of not just doing lack of integrity, but they're often trapped within a particular paradigm. And I'm like, and this is sort of the curse of INTJ. I listen to somebody. The reason I know what they're going to say next is because I detect what their paradigm is. Mm-hmm. And then I'm just like, oh, it's a waste of time. Like, it's literally a waste of time. I will never reach this person.
Because they can't think outside of that.
They can't. I mean, there are people who go, like, they learn, like, 5-factor model in psychology. They're like, basically the scores you get in 5-factor model are your personality. It's not that the scores are a map to a territory of a person. The scores are your personality. And I'm like, if that's what the person believes in, they have this paradigm about measurement as reality, unless I call that out, and that's why I'm not afraid of ad hominem attacks on people, because I don't really see it as that. I'm just like, your paradigm is bad. It's not even, it sounds like it's you that's bad, but it's your paradigm that's bad. But I'm not going to address the topic you're saying because it's pointless. I refuse to play by your rules. And I think a lot of thinking types do that, is they expect other people when they're in the toxic space to play by their rules. And then I think for the feeling types, it's like, you need to excuse yourself from that unless they're asking you to be more responsible. And then it goes back to the thing you said.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that's what you said then, is it ultimately comes down to is how can you step up to be more responsible and more authentic? And that those are like essential pieces there.
Yeah. Well, and I think the challenge is that if you look at it through the lens of type theory, we all have high certainty in our dominant driver and auxiliary co-pilot functions. Those are places of certainty for us, and we feel good about them. And we're always going to try to front face those. Like, we're going to try to put whatever we believe is our best foot forward and portray them. But by the time we get to like that, third, but definitely fourth function, the inferior, or what we call the 3-year-old, by the time you get there, you're in a place of deep uncertainty. And so a lot of times I think what we tend to do, and we do it it's easiest to see, I think, in people who have decision-making or judging functions as their driver dominant and 3-year-old inferior. It's like the easiest way to see it, but we also do it when we have intuitive and sensing functions too. But there's this sense of, let's take an INTP or an ISTP troll who has a lot of confidence in their information and data, or at least their ability to suss that out, but very, very little confidence in whether or not anybody else cares, right? That extroverted feeling or harmony, which is like, do I have value as a person? Do I have value to others? Am I a contributor? Do I have anything that other people want from me? And if you don't have a sense of certainty in that, then basically what you're trying to do, as opposed to just letting yourself be in that space and ask, right? How can I serve you better? How can I connect better? I'm not good at this, so I'm not really 100% sure. What's a way that I could communicate this information that would make it more like we're in a vibe together, that we're connected through this? That is an act of humility. That's an act of modesty to go, I'm not really sure how other people are taking my information. And so I need to sit with that uncertainty, and I need to kind of go, okay, well, this is a place where I feel deeply insecure, but okay, here I go. I want to offer, right? That's a place of sincerity, right? And I think what happens to ITP types when they become trolling is they keep trying to use an introverted process to convince themselves of outer world value, right? If I keep doubling down on my introverted thinking, if I keep doubling down on my assessment of my value, then eventually I'll stop caring about other people's, assessment. But clearly that's not true, because they keep trolling. They keep trying to engage other people in an interaction. They keep trying to prove their worth, while at the same time not allowing themselves the benefit of feeling insecure for a minute and going, well, actually, I need to use outer world criteria to determine my outer world value, right? I can't keep using my introverted thinking as an internal metric to determine something that's not internal. It's out there. And you'll see that in the reverse. Extroverted, let's take extroverted feeling as the driver dominant, and introverted thinking as the 3-year-old or inferior. And there's this, EFJs have a tendency, when they're not sure what their value is internally around maybe their intelligence or their information or their ability to be reasonable, they'll keep using outer world criteria to help them determine inner world value, right? And so they'll go get certificates, or they'll go get credentials, or they'll go to, they're using social things as a mark of approval on whether or not they're smart enough or know their stuff or are logical enough. But you can't use outer world feedback to build inner world evaluation or estimation. You have to self-estimate. And so an EFJ needs to get to a place where they're like, no, I just will always question whether or not I have the right end of the stick. I'm just always going to question whether or not my logic is good here. I just always am. And I need to like rest into that and go, well, maybe some of the messages from that part of who I am that's saying maybe you should do better, or maybe, like you have to calibrate yourself. Maybe that's not the voice of an enemy. That's not an inner mean girl. I don't need to run away from that and always be seeking everybody else's approval, right? I'm good, right? I have this down. I got the certification. They just have to go, okay, well, I guess I'm just got this stuff inside of me and I got to listen to it. And maybe I do need to calibrate, and maybe there's a message in there for me, and maybe I can start trusting myself and relax into that. Or, if I feel insecure, just know that that's a thing that happens for me, but stop using outer world criteria to calm down something that can only be done in-house, right? I have to stop outsourcing my self-esteem around my intelligence. And there's a corollary with extroverted thinking and introverted feeling, right? It's basically outsourcing something that has to be in-house, or trying to convince oneself on the inside of something that can only be determined in the outside world. And I think that's where projection happens a lot. And that's where trolling behaviors happen. And that's where overcompensation and coping mechanisms and all this like toxic stuff is. It's like, you got to determine where the source of the insecurity is, and you've got to take it to that space. And you have to take responsibility for it in the space that it lives, right? If it's an extroverted function, you cannot do it in-house. It's got to be interaction.
So what would you say then? Then this is a real world example, and we're going to turn it now to somebody who has dominant perceiving. So I'm sitting in the airport one time, waiting for my flight. There's some dude sitting across from me who I'm guessing from body language and so on is INTP preferences. I don't know, but at that point, then I see somebody sort of like this other guy who's older, who is eyeing the people around him, and I'm like, oh, it's an ENFP. I can just quote after 30 years of type. I'm like, this isn't. This is ENFP.
You could smell us.
I could smell. Yes, ENFP, and I've known a lot of ENFPs.
You have a perfume.
So what he's doing in that moment is he's looking for a victim, and I can just smell it. And he looks at me, and I give him a look back that like, I know exactly what you're doing. And then he doesn't make eye contact with me again because he clearly, so I can't fool this person. But he identifies the person sitting across from me, this hapless INTP.
You mean he's looking for a mark?
He's looking for a mark.
Okay.
And
a victim to him.
A victim for,
to take advantage of.
So he's
not somebody to help.
He's a con man, and he's
gotcha.
He's looking for a mark. And I just knew in this moment when I saw him, like, I know exactly what you're doing, and like, you're just wasting your time if you even think.
The Saul Goodman version of an ENFP. Yeah, the Better Call Saul.
Yeah, well, this is a dangerous person. Not the first ENFP I've met like this. And I watch over the next 45 minutes as I'm waiting for my flight as he sits himself down next to the INTP and proceeds to sell him on a con. And the poor INTP is just drawn right into it. And so it's like, what is it then? What is the insecurity? What is driving? Well, obviously, this ENFP has done this many times before. What is driving him to do this? Why is he doing this? What will be a toxic outcome for somebody else? I don't know. That's a good question. But we can pose it and we can say, like, can we work it out then? It's like, where is this insecurity there? Is it something with introverted sensing?
I would think it's a place to feel superior or okay with the self. I mean, I think that's probably one of the things that would come up is if I have the ability to, take advantage of this person, then I'm reflecting back to myself that I have the resources to do anything in the world that I need to do in any situation I find myself in. It's almost like a proving of the ability to do what needs to be done when I need to. So it's probably a little bit of a game also for this person. My guess would be.
Yeah.
Again, we're speculating wildly, but
yes, yeah. Like it doesn't look like he needs this mark in order to make a lot of money or something like that. I don't know. But I do get the feeling a little bit, it's extroverted intuiting, so there's a game element to it. But at some level, he probably knows in his conscience that this is wrong. So did he turn off his conscience? Especially we're talking about introverted feeling. Or did he rationalize like, most people in the world are sheep, and if they get used, then that was their fault. They're a dumb sheep. Mm-hmm. And some, most of the gazelles get away, but this one gazelle is slow and stupid, and I'm a predator. Like at what point did he turn off his conscience? Yeah. Was it something gradual, or was it like, this works?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think in those kinds of situations, looking at it strictly through type theory, because there's a lot of other stuff going on, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's probably like there's a whole history there that is unknown. But just looking at it through function preferences, I do think that EFPs, I don't know if ESFPs are as given to this as ENFPs, but I think they are. There's a measure of boredom that I think comes in there. Like you said, it's a game. So extroverted intuition is bored and it's looking for something to play with. There is a piece of that. I think with introverted feeling, there's there's an ability to look away from the sympathy one would have. How you mentioned, these people are marks. They're and the introverted feeling part goes, well, I would never fall for a con, so I can't sympathize with somebody who can. But I also think that there is there's hubris around the ability to outrun the guilt. Right? Like it's never going to catch up with them. And I think that is a rejection of both introverted feeling and introverted sensing, right? There's this sense that like the past will never catch up with me. Mm-hmm. I'm always going to be 2 steps ahead. I'm always going to be able to outrun that. But the second an ENP slows down, the second they start to root themselves, here comes the past ready to be, reevaluated, ready to be, to remind them of all the things that they have to sort of reconcile in order to be able to have roots, in order to be able to like want something and settle. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not going to mention Better Call Saul because it was an amazing end to that series. I don't know if you've watched it.
No. Yeah.
I won't ruin it or anything, but it's if you want to see an ENFP con man go through this entire life cycle and get to a place where their desire to find, when they finally found what they really wanted, right? When they finally were able to rest into what they really wanted, and the floodgates of everything that was waiting for them, right, to have to sift through. I think it's an ENFP's hubris that will never catch up. They'll never have to do that work of reevaluating all of their actions. They'll never have to do the work of sympathizing with their marks. Like all that stuff can be outrun in perpetuity just to feel the rush of the game right now.
And it seems like some of it is a deliberate self-stunting of their second function. And I see this, so to use an adjacent type, ENFJ as an example, introverted intuiting has a tremendous amount of potential to help a person, but it's also easy to stop at a sort of woo-woo level and be like, oh, well, I did this because my dreams told me so. And to just, which it might be okay in that particular circumstance because there's something that clicks in the person. But to have this technique, and so what was it one of you described that Jung invited some people to go with him on like a trip or something.
Oh,
so what was that?
John Beebe told us this story of a young man who was inviting people who were at in Zurich with Jung and his institute there. He was inviting people to go to the lake with him that weekend. And one of the women who had originally gone there because she had had a mental breakdown, but then she recovered and then she just didn't want to go. And so Jung gave her some tasks. He asked her and she said, I'll let you know what my dreams tell me this weekend. And so this young man came, talked to Jung about it. And he's like, why'd she say that? And he's like, and Jung goes, well, what would you have said? And he said, well, I would have said, I have to check my schedule, right? To see if I can. And if I can, then I would have made a decision whether or not I wanted to. And he said, well, that's because you're fit for life. Jung told him, you're fit for life. And he said, not everybody's fit for life at this stage. And so what you're talking about is like an over-reliance on an intuitive preference without having that integrated sensing component, which is anybody who makes sensing decisions, like whether or not you're going to go to the lake with friends that weekend, through massive abstractions of dreams. That is a completely unintegrated sensing opposite to that, because that's not an intuitive question. It's a sensing question. And if you are incapable of meeting a situation where it's at, like using the function that's appropriate for that, you are incapable of it, and you can only use, say, an intuitive preference. That's you're synthetically stunting it, because it needs the opposite side in order to like fully manifest.
And I think the opposite happens with people with a sensing preference. That they're going to sample some actual data from a situation, like somebody they know or whatever, and then they come up with a very elaborate conspiracy theory about what is really going on in the situation. And I don't mean some broad thing like, are there UFOs or something like that? I'm like talking about something in their immediate situation that under normal circumstances they would just solve with sensing.
Right.
But for some reason, there's this disconnected, unintegrated intuiting that is almost like taking control of them.
Yes, it can happen the opposite direction.
Yes, yeah.
Well, and that's what happens with an unintegrated function, is that it just pops up when it wants to pop up, right? Like you can either have the experience of being unable to access that function most of the time, and that is one-sidedness. But the challenge to one-sidedness is all of a sudden now it's controlling you from the shadows, because it's now it's in your unconscious, right? They call that fourth function the inferior, the beginning of the shadow. A lot of times, the beginning of the unconscious, and the reason why is because every once in a while it just starts jerking your chain, and now you're like, it's a big conspiracy, and it's like that's not how you would normally see that. But now you're at this function's mercy because you don't have a relationship with it, and when it pops up, you don't even know that it's around.
Which is why I think it's so important for people to pay attention to their seventh and eighth function. That doesn't mean to try and super develop it or whatever it is, but don't let it demonize you. I mean, that function or functions, don't let them demonize you or use those, as they come out, to demonize other people. Like, terrorize, I think is the word, terrorize other people. And so in a sense, like the toxic personality is a terrorist. And there's an element of reality distortion and not taking responsibility and sending out bad vibes and having unintegrated material. We can point to a lot of these different things, but at the end of the day, there's this feeling, it's like of harm, and that's I think this conversation could keep going. Yeah, but it's yes.
So let's land this plane then.
Let's land the plane.
How do we wrap this up to somebody that's listening right now? We went on a lot of different abstractions. We talked a lot about different stories. Someone's listening right now saying, you know what? Maybe I do have some toxic personalities in my life. What are they supposed to do? How can we address this as people moving through the world? Should we be looking at everybody as a possible toxic personality? I don't think that's the answer. I think that's what sometimes we're encouraged to do through the media. I think that's why I recoiled when you said just block next.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people say stuff to me that I could almost see myself labeling as toxic, but man, I'm glad they told me this, or I'm glad I got that from them, because now I can look at something I got triggered around. I can deal with that in my life. So I guess that's maybe the first step, is not everybody that gives you something that's challenging is toxic.
That's right. Yes.
Right. And then maybe the next step is to say, there are probably toxic people that you have maybe in your personal life, friends and family that are close to you, but also there's going to be people that you just encounter through life in general. Friends and family, that's a touchy situation. If you have a toxic person in your immediate circle that you have to spend a lot of time around, how do we as people deal with that? I think strong boundaries are important. Clear communication about those boundaries is important. If the situation obviously dips into abuse or anything like that, I suggest the person, and I think it would be common knowledge, you need to leave that situation and make the hard boundary changes you need to make in that. But what about those softer, they're not as clear cut as this person's harming me?
My advice is this. One is, for most of the people listening, they use type in some way. people can actually use type in a way to explain away toxic behaviors from other people. I'm reversing it. I'm saying, oh, well, this person, it feels really toxic, but they just have like, I don't know, like ESFJ preferences. So we explain it away and then we tolerate it when it's actually toxic because they're not actually a healthy ESFJ like some other ESFJs. So I think people need to be aware of the danger of using type to be okay with everything when it's not. But my specific antidote is to take a break. So boundaries doesn't mean yes, no. And I know this is particularly hard for some folks. It's not like all or nothing. You can say something like, I'm going to limit to this specific interaction space. Or let's take a break for a year and then give myself time to reflect on it and then go back and re-expose. And then that will give me some fresh eyes because I'm no longer, adapted or inured to it.
You had this experience when you left your family situation and you realized that you were blaming other people when things would go wrong around you. You got away from it and you were reinserting yourself in the situation.
Yeah. And it took a long time because, first of all, it wasn't a behavior that happened all the time.
Sure.
And I didn't blame people in the big picture. It was only when I become frustrated with something very specific.
Yeah.
And then if there happened to be somebody there, so this is something that would happen, like a few times a year or maybe once a month or when I get very upset. Not in the big picture. But I didn't see it until I went home like 30 years later. And I'm like, wow, okay, that's where I got that behavior. Yeah. And it's no longer tolerable to me because at some point I got enough feedback in my adult life to stop doing that. That it's unfair. Like the other people around me are people too, and they didn't deserve or earn that. So I would say distance doesn't mean 100% cut off, never see them again. Because sometimes that's we can't even afford to do that, like an ex-spouse or something like that. But to have some kind of boundaries that say only in this situation or after a period of time or whatever it is, and then come back and see, and that might mean 2 years or 5 years, but it could also mean just a few weeks to get a sense maybe that was just a random thing that happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think if a person is really if they're a crazy maker and they're bringing out the worst in you and you're bringing out the worst in them and it's just a bad situation. I think most of the time we can extricate ourselves.
Yeah.
Most of the time. But I think you're talking about like you said, ex-partners, spouses,
right?
Or
when you still have
family.
some shared responsibility or something
right.
like that, and you have so hit it on the head that there's this: are they bringing out the worst in each other? And in therapy, it's called the double bind. And this is the identifier when you talk about crazy making. Damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Right.
And if you feel that you're in this situation where no matter how you respond to this person, damned if you do and damned if you don't, that relationship has placed you in a double bind and is unhealthy.
Yeah.
Is also a chance to grow, but is also unhealthy.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's better to have experienced that and then grow in retrospect.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I would add to what you were saying. The one thing that came up for me too is for the most part, I mean, I have ENTP preferences. Anybody who's going to disrupt my calm on that level, I just don't have in my life. I don't have any problem with it. It does not bother me at all to sever ties with people that I believe are unhealthy for me. But we have found ourselves in situations, or I found myself in situations where there are some people who are profoundly unhealthy and I don't really have an option. They've got to be around sometimes. And for me, the strategy is I just don't give them anything. When you call it boundaries, to separate for a time, but I also feel like I just keep whatever is me. It's almost like I've surrounded myself in tape. I'm not going to let my energy go out of me at all. I don't give them any of my energy. I'm just totally neutral. I'm 100% flat in those situations, and I'll just get business done. And I find that for people who are in a lot of coping mechanisms and engage in a lot of toxic behaviors, they need the energy to work with. They have to have something to work with. And if you give them nothing, it's almost like it's a wet firecracker. Right?
Well,
it deflates the balloon.
and you will know then when that's happening, when that person gets very frustrated that you're not giving them something.
Yeah, but then they just go away because you're still not giving them anything.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's nothing. It's like you're at an impasse.
Yeah.
Or they're at the impasse. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, so we solved all the problems of toxic personality.
I think we help people become aware of it.
I do too. And I think that some of these principles can apply. And as you're listening right now, one of the things, there's probably a lot of stuff coming up for you. As you're listening along, you probably are identifying people in your life. Maybe they're not the most healthy expressions of their personality or as a person in general. And you realize maybe that they're toxic. So we want to hear from you. You haven't had a microphone. You've been the fourth person in this conversation. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Keep it sane, keep it civil, but let us know what's coming up for you in all of this. Some of this might touch on some really deeply personal wounding you have as a person from the people in your life. But go ahead and share your thoughts, ask your questions, and more importantly, share your stories. I think stories are really great ways for us to get an insight into what experiences you've had as a person. So I want to invite you to come over and make your voice heard.
Yeah, I think we picked on extroverted feeling a little bit and introverted thinking a little bit, but I think that that's actually probably not a bad thing, because I suspect that these conversations actually trend towards the extroverted thinking and introverted feeling users as toxic, and I think it's not bad to point out how the other side can also show up in this way. So if you're a person who has those preferences, so do I, and sometimes we kind of need to hear some of that. But of course, any type can be toxic, so remember that too. All right, so here I go on my brand new, whatever it is that I say at the end of the podcast. I'm going to try to figure out. So what I normally would say is, if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating review for us on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. And of course, we are also doing video podcasting. So if you would subscribe to us on YouTube or leave a comment, that would also help us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. I'm going to get this. I really am. I just got to reprogram my introverted sensing. Figure all this out. We have a suite of programs that are designed to help you integrate the other side of your functions, transcend, not be a toxic person because of one-sidedness, and help get through those coping mechanisms by understanding yourself better and having some self-reflection on how you can show up as the best version of yourself. So head over to personalityhacker.com and look at that suite of programs. One of the programs that were mentioned in this podcast was the Young on Yoga program.
Personality types in yoga, yeah.
Yeah, that we're calling Personality Types in Yoga. That is subtitled Young on Yoga, which is basically Carl Jung's opinions and his recommendations and the merging of his understanding of psychology as well as yoga practices and breath work that help you get that mind-body connection. If you're highly intuitive, it will help you integrate that sensing side, which is oh so crucial, as we talked about. And if you have sensing preferences, it will help you tap into the intuitive side. So it doesn't matter what your personality type is. It's really important to integrate all of those aspects. So head over to personalityhacker.com and check out that program and see if it is right for you at this time.
Well, and it's not just, Dario was part of that program. He's the driver of this program.
That's right.
And if you want to see or experience Dario doing breath work and actual yoga sets and teaching all about this, I think it's a great program to get. Yeah. Also, people can find you online, right? You have tons of books you've published.
Yeah. So they can go to www.radiance, that's with an A, radiancehouse.com. And from there, branch off to find PDFs or go to Amazon, wherever it is that they're looking for. Some of the items are free. There's also ebooks. There are physical books, material from over the past 20 years.
Yeah. Absolutely. We'll have to have you back on the show at some point in the future.
That's right. No. Sorry. I didn't mean. No. I was talking over you. It's good.
All right. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
I'm Dario Nardi.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves. not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.